He thought a sentence could erase a man. In the center of a dining room built to impress, under a chandelier that threw glass prisms across polished marble, a man with $1,000 watch and a voice practiced to command a room decided to teach someone a lesson. The $1,000 watch glinted as he lifted his hand. The clinking of crystal quieted a little. People turned their heads the way light turns toward a new flame. The restaurant was one of those places where the napkins looked like origami and the menu was recited like a poem. Linen folded, servers gliding between tables, the soft hush of private conversations. It was the kind of dinner where people expected to be admired more than fed. At a corner table bathed in amber, Alexander Whitmore, broad-shouldered, tailored like a suit of armor, a patron who moved through circles of investors and artists, held court with an entourage who nodded when he laughed and clinked their crystal when he made a point. He had that look of someone used to being believed before he spoke. Across the room, 3 seats down, Marcus Hill sat with 2 colleagues discussing a deal. Marcus was not flashy. He wore a navy coat that fit him because he had learned how to buy well, not loud. He had the steady, plain certainty of a man who knew his work and expected nothing from strangers. He checked his messages, smiled at the server who set down his glass, and listened. No one in the room expected a confrontation. No one expected that Alexander, intoxicated by the permission wealth gives to insult, would make Marcus the evening's lesson. It began small, a remark tossed like a pebble into a ceremonial pond. Alexander's gaze drifted toward Marcus. He leaned in across his table and, with his voice lowered so only the nearest tables could pick up the insolence, said something about not fitting the room. He spoke as if describing an artifact misplaced on a mantelpiece. People nearby heard the shape of the insult, thinly veiled class disdain edged with the kind of dig that always carries something more when the target is black. Marcus felt it, the way anyone does when a hand reaches for their dignity. He did not react. He set his fork down, blinked, and kept talking to the woman beside him about the presentation he would give next week. That quiet was not weakness, it was a choice. Alexander's smile hardened. He dialed the volume of contempt up. He spoke louder, as if those words needed an audience. The tone shifted, gentle mockery into pointed humiliation. He asked Marcus, actually asked him, if he was lost. He suggested, in a flourish that wanted to be witty and landed his cruelty, that perhaps Marcus belonged with the staff. It is important to be precise. He did not name-call. He did not scream slurs from across the dining room. He used insinuation, the kind that carries the same weight without breaking the rules of civility. He framed it as a joke so it could be laughed at.
People around him tittered nervously, the uncomfortable laugh of those who prefer not to choose sides. Marcus answered slowly. He corrected the assumption with calm facts. He was there on business, not as staff. He explained he was meeting with potential partners. He smiled in a way that kept everything a polite transaction. He did not rise to the bait. That steadiness increased the ire on Alexander's face, the small veins mapping at his temple the way male entitlement sometimes does when it is challenged. The seconds in that room stretched. Waiters, trained to smooth ruffled feathers, hovered with the practiced neutrality of people who have seen many tempers. The manager watched from across the room, hands folded, calculating whether to intervene. A woman from Alexander's table leaned in and whispered that he had had too much to drink. He bristled at the suggestion. That bristle was the spark. "You're bold," Alexander said, loud enough now that people at neighboring tables heard the word as a barb. "I like that. Bold doesn't belong here, though. Bold makes people uncomfortable, especially when it thinks it belongs in a world it hasn't bought." It landed like a slap, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way they were aimed. Eyes turned toward Marcus. Phones that had been casually on the table were now in hands, lenses pointed like small, waiting judges. If this story grabs you, subscribe for more. The first CTA slipped in softly, no commercial segue, just a single line, a small instruction to the audience that this was a kind of story they might want to see again. The dining room, however, did not have a subscription button. It had a live, escalating moment. Alexander's voice grew sharper. He made a gesture, one of those casual gestures the wealthy use when they announce that someone is invisible to them. He reached across space and touched Marcus's shoulder, the touch meant to orient as much as to claim space. Marcus did not flinch. That was the point of rupture. The touch turned physical when Alexander, with the careless violence of a man who believed position made him exempt from consequence, shoved. It was not a theatrical shove. It was small, intimate, a deliberate breach. It might have been dismissed as drunkenness on another night. Not tonight. The shove knocked Marcus's chair against the marble. Wine trembled in a glass, a slow pendulum, and a drop escaped the rim and traced a dark bead across the tablecloth as if time itself were marking the moment. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. The restaurant's background music tapered into near silence. The clink of silver and low conversation receded as if submerged. Phones went vertical. People leaned forward not because they wanted to, but because they could not look away. The scene had the awful clarity of a thing becoming public. Alexander's entourage shifted, faintly embarrassed, caught between the reflex to protect and the reflex to deny.
One of the men at his table, a younger face with the sheen of recent success, laughed too quickly, the sound cracking. A woman curled her fingers around her wineglass and did not stop to consider how it would sound. Marcus stood up. Not in fury, not in theatrics. He stood because a man who has been shoved in a public place has a decision to make: escalate, ignore, or end the interaction on his own terms. He kept his voice steady. He said to Alexander, simply, that he could leave, that there was no need to continue the spectacle. He offered dignity as a shield. Alexander leaned in, his face a study in contempt. "You'll leave?" he offered. "No, watch. Watch the kind of people who think they belong here." He gestured broadly at the room, including the staff adjusting the cutlery like stagehands. Then, with the complacent cruelty of someone who believes that humiliation is the same as correction, he spat a sentence meant to sever Marcus from everyone in the room. It was a taunt soaked in assumption about race and class, wrapped in mockery, designed to make the man small. Marcus felt the weight of it. His jaw tightened. He could have pushed back. He did not. He repeated his earlier offer. He'd go, if leaving made it stop. He moved like a man giving the kindness of an exit. The $1,000,000 watch ticked a little louder to Alexander. Money, after all, often insists on spectacle. He rose from his chair the way kings rise in paintings, slowly, with the intention of making the room see. He took a step across the space between them, his entourage parting like a flock obeying a gesture. There was a measured arrogance in his approach. This was not about an apology. This was about a statement. He wanted to show Marcus his place by making him the center of shame. But there was someone else in the room who had been watching the whole time with a different kind of attention. Andre Carter had been at a table a few feet away, a friend of Marcus's and a fellow investor on this trip. Andre's suit was unassuming. His laugh had been low and unobtrusive. He looked like any man who kept to himself in places where flash is currency. He drank his water, he folded his napkin, he watched the lines of the room. His presence was the kind of detail you miss if you are not looking for it. He had the look of someone who had learned to disappear when necessary and act decisively when required. When Alexander stepped forward, Andre rose with the same quiet efficiency with which a conductor lifts his baton. He did not fumble, he did not shout. He moved like someone whose job it was to be exactly where instruments say the music must hold. Nothing cinematic announced his approach. No soundtrack swelled. He simply reached Marcus's side in 2 strides, placing a hand lightly on the man's forearm. It was the kind of contact that says both "I am here" and "you are not alone." The room noticed only because the air shifted, the sort of invisible tilt that causes glasses to tremble.
Alexander stopped short as if surprised by a wall. He found himself face to face with Andre for the first time and had the disorienting moment of realizing the man he chose to humiliate had a companion who neither flinched nor argued. "Sir," Andre said, his voice low and controlled, "we don't need to make a scene." Alexander laughed, a sharp, startled laugh, then tried to shrug off the interruption with a joke. He attempted to reclaim the air, to turn the presence into a prop. "Oh, is this the bodyguard?" he said, dismissive. "How quaint. Did you drive him here in a limo, too?" The insult was childish. It worked like one, expecting an angry retort. Alexander's smile widened, confident that the room would collapse into his narrative if he was charming enough. He took a step forward anyway, the kind of step that belonged in a courtroom or a stock floor, confident that movement equals power. Andre did not escalate. His hand dropped to Alexander's wrist with the precision of someone trained in restraint. It was not a violent grip. It was firm, judged, a lever applied exactly where the body yields. He turned Alexander's wrist outward. The man, wealthy, not expecting resistance, found the motion as surprising as it was final. Balance betrayed him. In a quick, economical motion, Andre guided Alexander's momentum down to the floor, not with a shove or a stomp, but with a rotation and a controlled descent that used the aggressor's own forward motion against him.
The sound the room made when a man in a suit hits the marble is an intake that feels like a collective shock. A few plates rattled, a child's cry from a neighboring table leaked into the space. Alexander landed on his knees, then his hip, stunned, his hand now pinned lightly behind his back. The movement was clean. It carried the authority of someone who always planned for such an eventuality and had practiced its restraint until there was nothing showy in the execution, only effectiveness. No bone-crunching power, no theatrical brutality. A wrist control, a knee to prevent leverage, a voice that snapped orders and a tone designed to be heard over the hush. "Stay down," Andre said. "You're done." Phones hovered like moths, capturing. Somewhere nearby, a woman began to weep softly. A server stopped mid-step, the tray balanced but forgotten. The manager, Alec Morales, burst from behind a partition, face pale, trying to assess the legal choreography that had just played out across his dining room. In the periphery, Alexander's companions were scrambling, some to help, others to separate, all now invested in distance. The scene had been swift, it had been precise, it had been televised by half a dozen pocket cameras before anyone had the chance to fully process it. Clips started to seed the air, 30 seconds here, a vertical clip over there.
Someone in an adjacent booth, a freelance videographer of sorts, who always filmed odd social moments for their own feed, already had a slow-motion shot of Alexander's descent. Andre kept his hold. He was not yelling. He spoke into Alexander's ear like a professional who had spent time learning how to preserve a scene. "Don't reach. Don't try anything. I will move if you cooperate." There is a craft to de-escalation that looks violent when you do not know it. It is a discipline of pressure and space control. Andre applied it with a measured hand. He did not shove Alexander's face into the floor. He simply made it impossible for him to continue. "You can't do this," Alexander sputtered, disbelief and mortified pride colliding. "You can't... Who do you think you are?" "I am someone who keeps this from getting worse," Andre said. "Sit still." The manager arrived at Andre's shoulder. "Sir," Alex said, breathless, "we need to calm this down. Are you all right?" He was addressing Marcus, the victim, as if the event required his reassurance before any other. Marcus nodded, the motion small and unembellished. He had a spot of wine on his sleeve, but his hands were steady. He made sure no one was hurt. He checked Alexander only because the sight of a man on the floor is a human thing, and because, even in the heat of humiliation, people still bleed and need tending. "Call the police," Alexander's cohort demanded, more for the optics than for protection. The younger man had pulled out his phone, the screen already lit. He threatened the action with the same tone he had used to invest money. It was a reflex. Call law, reclaim narrative. "Yes," Alex said, the manager's voice catching on training and fear. "We'll call them right away." He fumbled for the restaurant's phone, then switched to his mobile. "We have an assault. Please send someone, right now." The word assault dropped into the room and landed like a new phrase in a foreign language for some of the patrons. People began to whisper about cameras and consequences, and whether this would be washed from the room like a stain. Someone near Alexander's table began to stream the scene to a friend. The small vertical clip moved across networks at the speed small things do. One click, then another, a ripple. In 3 different feeds, the same shot circulated. Alexander's arrogance, a shove, a man falling, a wrist pinned. Andre did not let go. He did not add force to the moment to humiliate. He kept it controlled. He had the look of a man who had seen plenty of footage and understood how quickly it could be weaponized. He then did something else, something that underlined the difference between a violent takedown and a professional intervention. He shifted his posture to shield Marcus. It was a small angle, a slight step to the side, his body a physical strophe that read like an instruction, "Do not escalate." Alexander's female companion, who had sat silently with a perfect posture and a financing portfolio to her name, stood now and moved away. Her lips moved in what might have been a curse. Her phone went to her ear. The table's napkins fluttered like flags of retreat. A senior officer, the nearest patrol, Alec would later say, was called. But for the minutes that mattered, the only law in the room was what the cameras would interpret. Tech does not care about nuance. It cares about a frame. A powerful man knocked off balance, a poised black man, a hulking former soldier standing watch. That frame would be circulated without context. It would be a photograph of moral clarity to some, of inconvenient truth to others. The manager placed himself between the tables then, a human mediator stepping into a scene that had already been recorded in several cameras. "Sir, please," Alex said, turning to Alexander on the floor. "For the safety of our guests, please remain seated. We have called the authorities. Someone will be here shortly." Alexander's companions argued among themselves in hushed tones. One wanted to move their boss away, another kept filming, a token of the contemporary instinct to witness and to own the narrative. A woman at the back of the room whispered, "He started it." A man leaned forward and said, "He had it coming," the syllables like pebbles tossed into a pond that was already rippling. Marcus, meanwhile, did what people like him always do in public moments that wash into viral streams. He limited the spectacle. He gripped his chair, sat, and kept his face even. He refused to let the moment become a show staged for reaction. He had come to dinner to talk business, not to become the subject of feeds. Yet here he was, framed by 1,000 small lenses, forced into a role the world would rush to define. Some people shouted that the bodyguard had used excessive force. Others called it necessary. The room split by the old divisions, some determined to defend status, others watching for accountability. The forks clanked again as servers tried to continue. Patrons adjusted their napkins as if smoothing edges of discomfort. A voice near the entry announced urgency. Someone in the uniform had arrived and took out a pad. The first officer on scene asked for statements. He took Alexander's side's hurried account, the wealthy man insisting he'd done nothing wrong and that he had been attacked for no reason. He took Andre's and Marcus's versions, recorded them with the practiced neutrality of a man used to contradictory narratives. While the official account was being taken, something else had already left the room. A vertical clip no more than 20 seconds long had been uploaded. The first user to post it added a line, "Must watch." It showed in blunt terms the shove, the fall, the pin.
No commentary, no exegesis, because in the rawness of the frame the meaning seemed to unspool for viewers who had already made up their minds about who belongs and who does not. Within minutes the clip had been shared. Within 15 it had been reposted with a blunt caption that hinted at context. CEO humiliated black diner, bodyguard steps in. Facts were trimmed into bites that fit outrage like clothing. The narrative machinery of the internet had begun its work. Back in the dining room, Alexander's face was flushed with a color that money and power rarely buy, mortified confusion. He kept saying, "I didn't," as if repetition could rebuild pride. His companions tried to coax him, but he was raw in a way they had not prepared for. He fumbled with his cufflink, a small gesture that meant nothing to anyone but himself. He was, right then, naked of the social armor he had counted on. Andre's phone chimed. He ignored it. He kept his hand where it had to be. He was not a man hungry for footage. He was a professional, someone who had chosen to step into a role that demanded both force and discretion. The manager, having taken witness statements, looked outward at the room and then back at Alexander, who was sweating under the attention. "We'll cooperate fully," Alex said. "We will make the footage available to the authorities. We will do whatever is needed to ensure everyone's safety." Alexander's cohort began to whisper about reputations, about damage control. Names that had been spoken in the confidence of wealth, investors, donors, a foundation chair, were now spoken with mouths gone small. The kind of people who profit from association had to recalibrate in real time. Andre finally released Alexander's wrist, not with brutality, with a pragmatic motion that set conditions. He stood. He kept his eyes on the man on the floor and said, "Don't follow him outside. Let it be handled by the authorities." Marcus, who had been steady as stone through the episode, now took a long breath and sat back. His hands had a speck of wine on them. He wiped it with a napkin and folded it carefully. He did not raise his voice to gloat. He did not make a performance. There was no victory dance. The dignity of restraint had weight in the room. It was something that did not translate into headline language easily, and yet it was perhaps the most important thing happening in that moment. Yet the cameras had already translated the frame into 1,000 different tongues. People who had not been there were already parsing it. The clip spread to influencer pages first, 2 seconds here, 18 there, with commentary that bent it into shapes the commentators preferred. Some wrote about the entitlement of the wealthy. Others asked whether the bodyguard had used undue force. A small cluster of commenters pointed out that it was odd that a man in such a public place had a bodyguard at all. That last observation was common at first. Why does he need a bodyguard?
But the question mutated as the night wore on. In the feeds, the man on the floor did not appear as a millionaire in a suit so much as an archetype, the powerful Feld in front of witnesses. The feeds do not care for the messy middle. They prefer pictures that speak clearly. Inside the restaurant, the police officer closed his notebook and asked for everyone's ID. He asked Alexander to step outside for a breathalyzer. Alexander, bewildered, complied with the indignity of a man who had not imagined being judged by science and paper. Andre stayed near Marcus, a steadying presence. The manager moved between the two groups as if trying to stitch the room back together, though the fabric was already torn by the force of a single social act. Minutes stretched like hours. Security photos would later show the dining room with its chairs in disarray and puddles where wine had splashed like small constellations. But it's not the puddles that mattered. It was the clip that left the scene behind and hurtled into the public view.
By the time the first officer left to file a routine report, 3 different feeds had the clip. By the time the paramedics arrived, called more from protocol than from necessity because a man had fallen and the public needs a professional touch, there were direct messages alerting reporters. The restaurant, once a bubble of curated taste, became a node in a network that does not forgive. Alexander's phone began to ring in earnest. His inner circle texted deflections. Someone suggested calling his PR person. Someone else even, in the frantic minutes after the incident, murmured about legal recourse. These are the kinds of conversations people with a lot to lose have very quickly. They are practiced at scrambling. Marcus collected himself, let the staff do their jobs, and when the officers were done, when the statements were recorded and the initial contours of what had happened were established, he left. He did not seek cameras. He did not issue a statement. He walked out into the night with the same even gait he had had when he walked in. He had not wanted any part of the spectacle. He had not sought it. But the spectacle had found him. Outside, a cluster of phones and a few huddled spectators waited for a reaction. Some wanted a quote, some wanted a piece of fame to ride the clip to more views. A reporter leaned in and asked Marcus a question. He answered with a short sentence, that he trusted the authorities, that he was fine, that the dwindling spectacle in the room no longer concerned him. The clip kept moving. Within the hour, the posts had been tagged to accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers. A morning show would later air the footage between hostess banter and commercials. An online columnist would write that it revealed the rot of entitlement. Already, organizations that had once happily sat at Alexander's table were calculating distance.
At the center of it all, Marcus kept nothing to elevate him beyond what he was, a man forced into a viral moment he never asked for. He had been humiliated in public and protected in private. His protector had not paraded a trophy. He had simply done what needed doing. The next steps, what would happen to Alexander's immediate standing, which clients would step away, whether any formal investigation would follow, would unfurl in the hours and days ahead. For now, however, the room had seeded something fundamental. A narrative had started moving without Alexander's permission. People like Alexander had built careers on narratives. They polished reputations until they shone. They expected that a momentary misstep would be absorbed by money's centrifugal force. They had not yet understood the new logic. Cameras are indiscriminate recorders. The internet is a public square that remembers. And dignity, once stripped in public, can be reclaimed not by force, but by evidence and restraint. Andre walked Marcus to the Uber line at the curb, the protective space between them maintained like an invisible fence. He checked his watch, his jaws set in the way of someone who knows the job is not over when the immediate threat is neutralized. He had seen with his own hands how a single attack, meant to humiliate, could reorder the room. He had placed himself as a barrier, but he also knew the fight would move outward, into feeds, into headlines, into shareholder meetings. When Andre slid into the driver's seat of his car, he did not immediately post the footage he had. He did not brand himself with it. He would, later, be quoted in a careful statement if required. For now, his silence was protective. He had left the restaurant with the taste of wine and tension in his mouth, and the knowledge that the footage would not only define Alexander, but would define the evening for Marcus as well. That night, somewhere between midnight and the early hours, the social feeds hummed. Clips looped. People wrote hot takes. A hashtag began to gather momentum. It was a small meteor of outrage and curiosity that, in the coming hours, would break into conversation. But as the clip multiplied, the people in the room were left with their private versions of the same scene. The way a wrist was turned, the calm in the face of the man who was targeted, the measured response of the one who intervened. Those tiny details matter when you are trying to parse intention from the footage. Alexander sat in the backseat of a car hired by someone from his circle. His tie was askew. His expression had the flat character of humiliation not yet processed. He had been a man who believed insults could be exchanged without exposure. He had been a man who thought a shove could be an assertion of place. He was now a man whose moment had been captured and redistributed with a speed none of his old allies could stop.
And somewhere, on a screen no larger than a palm, someone who had no connection to the room at all pressed play. Watched the shove, watched the fall, watched the restraint, and made a private choice about what they believed. The feeds would decide what came next. The feeds would bring allies and detractors. The feeds would shape whether Alexander's clients called, whether donations paused, whether invitations evaporated. But in that moment, contained between glass and linen, the finality was not yet written.
It was only the beginning of a story that would not stop at a single clip. By morning, the clip had become a fact the internet argued over. Alerts chimed on phones before the city had fully woken. A push notification from a local outlet showed the vertical clip playing on its tiny preview, a shove, a fall, a wrist turning. Comments unfolded beneath it in real time, some calling for immediate condemnation of Alexander Whitmore, others questioning whether anyone had seen the whole story. The hashtag, sharp, easy to remember, began to climb. Inside Alexander's circle, the scramble had expanded into coordinated damage control. Advisors called managers. Managers called PR firms. A terse email asked staff to refrain from commenting while the team assessed the situation. 2 assistants pulled together upcoming engagements and flagged those that could be quietly postponed. A speaking event in 3 days was canceled with the polite phrase, postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. The charity gala scheduled for the weekend sent a short, formal statement, "We are monitoring developments." Language that once meant little now meant everything. Newsrooms reached out to the restaurant. Alec Morales, still hoarse from the night's adrenaline, answered a few calls and then stopped. He had been urged by his general manager to hand all recordings to authorities. He had also, in the hush between taking statements and opening for lunch, agreed to provide the restaurant's surveillance footage to the police and separately to a local station that had arranged to view the footage in person. There was a cautionary note in every decision. The restaurant could not appear to take sides, but it could not also downplay an incident that had turned its space into a moment of national conversation. Marcus woke later than usual because his body had decided the night was over once he reached his front door. He made coffee and stood at the window while the city accumulated sound, a distant honk, a dog barking, newspapers arriving. He read messages that had arrived in the small hours, a cousin asking if he was okay, a colleague offering support, an old classmate sending a crying laugh emoji and the single sentence, "You handled it better than I would have." He allowed a half smile, then replied with the same brevity he had used in the restaurant, "I'm fine, thanks." The morning for Marcus was the slow translation of an event into consequences.
A partner at the firm where he'd been meeting texted to say she had watched the clip and that their contact had reached out to say the meeting should be rescheduled, for everyone's comfort and to avoid distractions, she wrote. Marcus recognized the gentle removal. Business is often careful about optics. He accepted the reschedule without indignation. He had no appetite for becoming a symbol, even as the world around him pushed to make him one. Andre slept less. He sat at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold and scrolled through mentions on his phone. He had trained for situations like the one at the restaurant, positioning, wrist management, verbal commands to prevent escalation. He had not trained for the social deluge that followed. Direct messages alternated between thanks and pointed questions, some accusing him of excessive force, others praising him. An old contact at a security firm asked if he had time to talk. Some journalist accounts pinged to ask for a comment. Andre declined. He kept his answers to the police and to Marcus. If the world wanted to make him perform, he would not oblige. Within a day, larger outlets picked up the story and layered context to top the clip. A short segment analyzed the power dynamics of the room. A talking head compared it to similar viral incidents. Another piece dug into the financial calendar. Whitmore was scheduled to speak at a technology summit next month. He sat on the board of a nonprofit that relied on donor confidence. The narrative began to thread itself into the fabric of reputation. The image of a privileged man falling in a marble-floored dining room resonated in ways an editor could predict. But virality is not a straight line to judgment. Threads emerged that complicated the picture. Some commentators asked why a man in a public space had a friend who could physically intervene. Others argued that the presence of a protector in no way justified humiliation. Still others debated whether the restaurant had managed the situation properly. The clip delivered rawness. People supplied interpretation. Each interpretation was a kind of verdict. Alexander, whose first public utterance came as a carefully worded release through his spokesperson, took the defensive route. The statement read like an effort to reclaim narrative without acknowledging moral culpability. He claimed he had been provoked, that his actions were misunderstood, and that he looked forward to clarifying the facts with law enforcement. The language suggested he was willing to cooperate. It did not, however, offer contrition. A short video posted later, shot by a sympathetic friend where Alexander spoke with a guarded, brittle severity, was intended to humanize him. The video aired to skeptical eyes. The faces in the comment section were divided along familiar lines. Corporations and organizations that had associated themselves with Alexander faced choices: to act now or wait.
Several institutional partners released short statements saying they were concerned and had asked for more information. A private equity firm that had recently discussed a potential board appointment quietly paused discussions. Invitations to exclusive dinners vanished from RSVP lists. The calculus of association is quick, where money and brand are involved. While an email could technically keep things at arm's length, people perceive distancing in silences and in sudden absences. At the restaurant, Alec kept a ledger of small, practical things: who had been present, which cameras had what angle, which employees had been affected. He fielded calls from lawyers and producers. He went on local television to say little more than the truth. They would cooperate with any investigation. Safety was their priority. Patrons had the right to dine without humiliation. The clip, he realized, had turned his dining room into a courthouse of public opinion. He kept that in mind each time he stepped onto the floor. The police investigation unfolded with the procedural patience of institutional processes. Officers took statements, collected footage, and logged witness accounts. They treated it like any alleged assault, an incident that required documentation. Alexander and Andre both provided narratives. Marcus gave his. The footage, the vertical clips from patrons, and the restaurant's surveillance were cataloged. Whoever would ultimately make a charge or file an allegation would need more than public outrage. They would need legal thresholds. That was the work of officers and attorneys, not of timelines on social feeds. Meanwhile, social media traced a dozen tributaries. One viral influencer recreated the audio waveform and slowed the clip to reveal a pause before the shove, purporting to show the escalation. Another user overlaid the clip with text calling for accountability in the local community. A charity that once accepted checks from Whitmore's foundation issued a statement expressing concern. Their language hinted at distance. Donations, it seems, are not guaranteed when association becomes a liability. Amid the commotion, some of the more dangerous consequences were quiet human costs. Servers who had worked the night felt unsettled. Staff received messages from strangers with opinions about what had happened. Some patrons called the restaurant to complain about the disruption to their evening. Alec instituted shifts in the staff schedule and offered counseling resources for anyone who needed them. Responsibility, he recognized, included care for those who bore witness. Alexander's world tightened. The man who had moved through rooms on the assumption that social capital would erase small embarrassments now experienced the opposite: uncertainty. A call from a longtime patron, someone whose donations had lubricated many nights, asked if the board meeting scheduled for next week still stood.
A foundation liaison asked for a pause on large donor shipments. No legal ruling had been made. No court had issued any verdict. But reputations, like mirrors, crack under pressure. The pressure seeped into his business life. A younger partner texted that a client had concerns. A philanthropic committee postponed a meeting out of sensitivity. The practical ripple, bookings canceled, speaking engagements paused, became its own kind of punishment. It was not punishment assessed by law, but by the currency of trust. Alexander's entourage made a plan. Apologize in measured tones, emphasize provocation, highlight the misunderstanding. The strategy was old and often effective. It relied on the public's short attention span and on the ability to make a quiet, private reconciliation with partners who preferred not to be associated with scandal. But the clip moved faster than the usual spin tactics and had lodged itself enough feeds that private reconciliations would be costly. Marcus watched his life rotate in small adjustments. He answered a few calls from reporters on impulse and then decided he would only respond through a concise written statement. He would not be bait for sensational interviewers. His statement said what he wanted it to say. He refused to be humiliated. He was cooperating with authorities. He trusted the process. He emphasized dignity, not revenge. He thanked the staff and the authorities and avoided grand declarations. The statement spread in its own right. Some called it the voice of restraint. Others called it measured and unsightly for not delivering the moral catharsis some demanded. No one could force him to be the kind of hero a headline might prefer. The story settled into a rhythm of updates. Local outlets followed the police report. Opinion pieces argued about the obligations of the wealthy and the safety of public spaces. A university sociology professor used the incident as a case study in entitlement and surveillance. Panelists debated whether cameras were now the primary mechanism of redress in public conflicts. The narrative multiplied into a dozen essays and a pair of small talk show segments. In the days that followed, Alexander made a private visit to the restaurant to speak with the manager. Alec received the call reluctantly and agreed to a brief meeting with the understanding his statement would be limited. Alexander arrived with a legal advisor and a smaller set of companions than usual. The meeting was curt. Alexander insisted on telling his side. He had been drunk, he admitted, and provoked, he claimed, but he insisted the shove had been misread. Alec, who had seen the footage and taken the police report, did not need a lecture on perceptions. He listened and then said what he had been trained to say. The restaurant would cooperate with investigators and their policies. If Alexander wanted to apologize, The manager suggested the appropriate channel would be a private letter and a willingness to cooperate with any requests. Alexander, used to being delivered absolution by friends, walked out into a city that was no longer as forgiving. The philanthropic committee that had once counted on Alexander for substantial gifts convened. In a terse meeting, they discussed optics and governance. They released a statement. They were suspending planned collaborations pending a review. The language was bureaucratic, but functioned as a public distancing. Board members who had once eaten with Alexander in private rooms called their own advisors and considered their votes carefully. Power, the committee recognized, can be contagious, and alliances are fragile when the public demands accountability. All the while, the nuance that made the original clip a complex artifact was being lost in retellings. Some accounts simplified. A wealthy man shoved a black man, a bodyguard intervened, the powerful were humiliated. Simplification is the internet's native tongue, but the complexity of motive, of constraint, of personal histories and institutional responses remained in the margins, things that matter in the careful work of real consequences. Andre received a message from someone he had once supervised in a deployment. "Good job," it read, laconic and to the point. Another message from a legal acquaintance asked if he had considered that Alexander might press charges. Alexander had. He had already spoken with an attorney at the insistence of his own counsel. He was prepared to provide his account and the footage to the police. His actions, he believed, were protective, proportional, and meant to prevent injury. He was not interested in theatricalism. He had, after all, a life outside of being the man who stopped a millionaire. There were dogs to walk, bills to pay, a schedule to keep. A week after the incident, a short line in a financial newsletter signaled what many had been anticipating. One corporate partner had publicly severed a speaking arrangement with Alexander. The newsletter quoted a spokesperson saying that the organization does not condone conduct that undermines the dignity of any individual. The phrasing was careful and pointed. Stocks did not crash, that wasn't the scale of influence. But the removal of corporate oxygen matters. Invitations evaporate. A man can be well off and still find that influence wanes. As the mainstream media circled, the clip served as currency for two wider conversations. One argued that the clip proved wealth didn't immunize people from consequences in the era of cameras. The other argued that viral moments can distort complicated events into single-frame judgments. Both were true in part. The truth of the event had multiple priors. Marcus had his body, Alexander had his pride, Andre had his restraint, Alec had his duty, and the internet had its appetite.
One morning, Marcus received an unexpected call from a neighborhood organizer who wanted to turn the event into a conversation about public dignity. She proposed a small community forum where people could talk about how to protect one another and how to hold the wealthy to account without turning every incident into a spectacle. Marcus thought about it for a moment. The offer was earnest and practical. He agreed to attend, but insisted on no media fanfare. The forum drew a modest crowd: neighbors, some activists, a couple of church leaders, and a few people from nearby businesses. It was the kind of small, local gathering that rarely makes headlines, but does shape how people live together. Marcus listened more than he spoke. He left with a sense that some things worth changing happen in underlit rooms where people talk honestly. Alexander's lawyers, seeing the shift in public appetite, offered a narrow path forward: a mediated meeting with Marcus and the restaurant management, an acknowledgement that could be calibrated to avoid legal exposure while allowing for a face-saving gesture. Marcus considered, then declined. He did not need an apology constructed in a lawyer's office. He wanted his business week back. He wanted to be free from the constant adrenaline of someone else's shame. He wanted the episode to be a lesson, not a performative checkbox. So he refused the mediated apology. That refusal itself was a statement of agency. Not every consequence is public and immediate. In private, Alexander hovered between anger and self-defense. He made expense decisions that would have once been unremarked. He canceled a planned remodel in his townhouse. He stopped going to a private club he had frequented. He found himself reconsidering the ease with which he had assumed dominance in rooms. For a man who had been practiced in command, humility arrived awkwardly and unsolicited. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to live his life. He went back to meeting rooms. He rejoined his colleagues for a follow-up presentation. The deal that had been on the table at dinner moved forward. Colleagues praised his professionalism. He returned to his routines, to the small joys that stitched his days together. He asked his sister to bring over a casserole one night and laughed with his mother on the phone. The viral moment had not erased ordinary tenderness. Weeks later, a piece ran profiling Andre. The reporter had called repeatedly,
and Andre had finally agreed to speak on the record, not because he wanted the attention, but because he wanted to explain restraint as a principle. His quote read plainly, "I did what I had to do to keep it from getting worse." The article framed him as a measured presence, not a vigilante. It explained his background, years of training, not for spectacle, but for measured intervention. The piece raised a broader question. When a bystander must step in, what responsibility do they carry? Andre answered that question with the same economy of motion he had used in the restaurant. Prevent harm, preserve dignity, involve authorities. No one credited him with heroics. They credited him with professionalism. The legal process, always slow, continued. Investigators reviewed the restaurant's surveillance footage and the vertical clips. They interviewed patrons who had been in the room. Someone who had filmed the slow motion of Alexander's fall agreed to provide the raw footage. The police noted that the public nature of the assault, if it was to be termed such, would not preclude charges, but that the totality of evidence mattered. At one public hearing, an officer explained that their role was to determine whether the elements of a crime were present and to pass the file to the district attorney for any charging decisions. Months could pass. The machinery of justice is deliberate in a way that feels both methodical and sometimes maddening. In the weeks and months that followed, Alexander's name appeared in stories not only about the shove, but about the aftermath, canceled engagements, paused donations, and the slow erosion of a social calendar. He gave a paid interview to a magazine that attempted to humanize him with old photographs and accounts of charity work he'd done in past years. The piece did not entirely succeed. The clip still lived in the margins of every story about him, an indelible frame. Marcus's clip became a teaching moment in a university ethics class. Professors used it to talk about civility, class, and the ethics of intervention. Young students debated whether Andre should have used less force or whether Alexander's wealth had made him feel bulletproof. The debates were instructive. The footage served as an object lesson rather than as final judgment. For the restaurant, business returned, slowly, to what it had been before. Regulars came back, but there was a slight hush in the air, a new formality. Staff wore the memory of the night like a scar, there, healed, but visible. Alec instituted a short training program for staff on de-escalation and protocols for dealing with conflicts that might otherwise spill into violence. He also made sure employees knew the restaurant's commitment to guest safety. Practical changes were the restaurant's way of honoring the episode without being swept into the currents of public spectacle. The online argument about who was right rarely touched the human core of the incident. People argued about entitlement, about the ethics of bystander intervention, about the role of surveillance in moderating public life. Each voice added texture, but the individuals at the center of the story, Marcus, Andre, Alec, lived with the consequences in private ways that no thread could fully describe. One quiet afternoon, months after the incident, Marcus received an invitation to speak at a small workplace seminar on professionalism and conflict resolution. The organizer had seen how he had handled the aftermath and thought his perspective would be valuable. Marcus accepted. He spoke briefly about boundaries and dignity and the small choices people make in public moments. He told the audience that restraint does not equal submission and that dignity can be a form of strength. The room listened. No viral clip accompanied this talk. It was not sensational. It was simply people learning from someone who had been in a difficult position. Not everything healed neatly. Alexander continued to experience a diminution of easy privilege. Invitations that had once arrived by courier now arrived through email and sometimes silently ceased. He hired a consultant to help him rebuild, but the consultant's methods, public contrition, private repair, require a willingness to cede scripted narratives, and that step, for some, remains the hardest. Pride is a currency more stubborn than cash. Andre, for his part, did take a call from a security agency. He was offered work that required his kind of calm, disciplined presence. He accepted a contract that let him keep his privacy intact, a role advising small businesses on safety protocols and de-escalation. The job fit. He preferred a life where his actions were not fodder for commentary. He liked quiet evenings and the knowledge that sometimes the best intervention is the one that prevents a story from happening at all. Publicly, the incident became one item in a larger stream of stories about power and accountability. People used it as evidence in arguments that sometimes reached across divides. Employers tightened codes of conduct. Restaurants revised protocols. Activists argued for structural changes that would make public spaces safer for everyone. Change came in small policies and in conversations. Hardly the sweeping reform some hoped for, but not nothing. It was the reality of modern consequence. Small institutional shifts, a recalibration of invitations, a few lost engagements, a few new training sessions. Months later, a closed-door settlement emerged between Alexander and the restaurant, confidential, as most agreements are. The terms were not public. Alec called it a necessary step to close a troubling chapter, and asked the media to respect the staff's privacy. Marcus was not a party to that agreement. He had no interest in pursuing litigation. He had wanted only to be treated with the common courtesy they all deserve. At the end of it, there was something undeniable. A single moment in a place of taste had turned into a mirror for a broader conversation. A man who had assumed he could humiliate another in plain view had found the room recording him. He had been physically stopped by someone who chose to restrain rather than to injure. A community and a social media landscape had listened and judged, and institutions had adjusted according to the forces that shape modern life: evidence, optics, and public sentiment.
What lingered most for many people was not the clip itself, but the small human choices that followed. The manager who chose to call the police and file the footage. The staff who worked the night and kept going the next evening. The bystanders who either filmed or stepped in to comfort. The friend who simply stood beside the man being targeted and with his presence shifted the balance of risk. Those choices mattered because they were the ones with consequences that could be lived with afterward. There is, in the digital age, a new kind of accountability. It is messy. It is not always just. It does not replace the careful work of law and public policy, but it does add pressure where previously things might have been smoothed over or ignored. The camera does not always make the right call, but it does ensure that some moments can no longer be purely private in their impact. Months after that evening, Marcus met a friend for coffee at a small cafe not far from the restaurant. He chose a table by the window so he could watch people move through the street. They talked about ordinary things, projects, family, the small miseries of life. At one point, a couple at a nearby table began to argue quietly. Marcus listened for a moment, then interjected with a suggestion, calm, practical, and not at all performative. The argument quieted. The couple thanked him. He left without fanfare. If you watched the clip or shared it, you saw a short story, a shove, a fall, a wrist pinned. But the full story was longer and contained small, often overlooked things, choices about dignity, protocols to protect staff, the slow work of institutional decisions, and the quiet resolve of people who simply refused to let shame define them. The Millionaire had intended to make someone small in front of a room. Instead, for reasons both mechanical and moral, his spectacle became evidence of consequence. People will continue to argue about what the clip means and what it should mean. They will retell it as proof of entitlement or as a cautionary tale about quick judgments. Both readings make sense. The truth, always more granular, persisted in the lives of those who lived it. Marcus went back to work. Andre returned to the things that mattered to him. Alec reconstructed his staff schedules and improved safety protocols. Alexander navigated the difficult arithmetic of repairing public trust. The clip remained a potent window into how quickly power dynamics can be exposed when a moment is recorded. And somewhere, on feeds and in conversations, the lesson rippled outward. Appearances are unreliable, and restraint often carries more moral weight than domination. In a room that prized spectacle, dignity held its own quiet power. Cameras made sure the moment could not be forgotten. The rest was up to the people who chose how to respond. If this moved you, tap the video on screen now for another incredible true reversal.